let's use that to shift gears a little bit and go into our next segment, which was going to be to talk about the Liberals' new plan for reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Last week, they committed $9 billion in new spending to bring emissions down by the year 2030. And I want to play a clip of Trudeau making the announcement about that plan.
This is the moment for the oil and gas sector to invest in the sustainable future that will be good for business, good for communities, and good for our future. Big oil lobbyists have had their time on the field. Now it's over to the workers and engineers who will build solutions for their sector, for their communities, and for their kids.
Martin, have the Liberals really kicked oil lobbyists off the field?
I mean, despite what Trudeau says, the Liberals have not only not kicked him off the field, they're very much on the field, and they're on the same team. And, you know, the irony is that Trudeau made this climate announcement at the Globe Forum in Vancouver, which is funded by Shell and Suncor. So it basically means oil lobbyists are also the sponsors of the field. So the breach actually crunched the numbers on lobbyist data a few months back, and we found that under the Trudeau government, Big Oil had met with them even more often than they had met with the Harper Conservative government, up to 5 meetings and contacts with the government on a daily basis. This plan that we have now from Trudeau actually lets oil and gas industry cut even less emissions than any other sector. So it's no surprise that Big Oil is extremely happy with this. They, CAP, which is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, came out with a statement that basically applauding the plan for recognizing, quote, global demand for natural gas and oil will continue for decades. Of course, we need to get off oil and gas like yesterday. But meanwhile, you know, oil and gas industry is basically laughing their way to the bank, having made something to the tune of $115 billion in profits just last year alone. And I think ultimately, like the mainstream media in this country kind of goes through this ritual with the Trudeau government when it comes to their climate plans. Every 6 months to a year or so, they say, okay, this time the Trudeau government is actually serious about climate change. They've come out with another bold and ambitious plan. But I don't think we should be surprised by the fact that Big Oil keeps running the show. Trudeau essentially told us who he was back in 2013. He had just become leader of the Liberal Party, and he took a trip to Calgary where he gave a speech to the Calgary Petroleum Club. So he was speaking to a group of oil execs, and he told them, surprisingly, I think for a lot of people who are know about his environmental reputation, that he thought Stephen Harper had failed them. He had made too many enemies. He had basically not delivered on his pledge to turn Canada into an oil superpower that was getting oil everywhere. And and Trudeau said basically, look, you need a politician with a lighter touch, a diplomatic touch, who can, bring in a few environmental policies, ultimately so that we can get your oil to market. And that essentially is what Trudeau has accomplished over the last 7 years.
One thing I just wanted to add from that clip is Trudeau's like, no more corruption. We're not going to have oil lobbyists. We're going to have engineers. It's like, didn't SNC Lavalin almost bring your government down? Yeah. No more engineers either. Puppies.
Yeah, just none of them.
None of them.
So one of the things in the emissions reduction plan that I wanted us to spend just a couple of quick minutes on is the new tax breaks, Martin, that they're introducing for carbon capture and storage. I was actually looking at the pre-budget consultations that the Department of Finance did, and there's obviously always a submission from from CAP, Canada's biggest oil and gas lobby, and they specifically were asking for tax breaks on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Can you just tell us what CCUS, as it's known, is and why industry is such a fan of it?
Yeah, I mean, carbon capture is essentially the latest smoke and mirrors delay tactic on the part of oil and gas. It's an unproven, unscalable, prohibitively expensive technology that is essentially supposed to capture carbon dioxide from facilities and plants and then store it underground. The problem, and this is a very big one, is that 80% of existing carbon capture facilities, they actually capture carbon dioxide and then use it to extract even more oil. Like, it's a process called enhanced oil recovery. And just continuing on the theme of euphemisms, it basically uses carbon dioxide to get the dregs of oil from oil fields. So, this isn't a plan to reduce fossil fuels. It's a plan to essentially prolong and entrench their use. So naturally, oil and gas is extremely happy to keep digging and burning. And what they've done now is these oil and gas lobbyists have persuaded the Liberal government to actually pay for these facilities to be built. If reports are true, what we're going to see in the budget on Thursday is a tax credit that will have the Liberal government pay 75% of these essential techno fixes that are simply going to continue the status quo and entrench oil and gas production and expansion for 20, 30, 40 more years.
And it's worth noting the Liberals are simultaneously, while giving these tax credits, are committing to cutting fossil fuel subsidies. But essentially, and this was pointed out a month ago, or I think it was, there were something like 400 academics, 500 organizations across the country, and 30,000 other signatories who were saying, no, this is another form of subsidy. You're essentially continuing to subsidize the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, I mean, between 2018 and 2020, the Liberal government federally and the provinces gave 14 times more funding to fossil fuels than they did to renewable energy. Mm-hmm. So, they continue giving oil and gas basically what they want, and disguising it as, in new forms of hidden subsidy. I mean, the Liberals have committed to getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, and then they engaged in their usual weasel tactics by saying, oh no, we were just talking about inefficient subsidies, not efficient subsidies, and now they've created even more subsidies that we'll probably see in tomorrow's budget.
And of course, the Liberals bought a pipeline. So, Pam, I wanted to ask you, there was a new estimate just a few weeks ago that building TMX, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, is now going to cost around $21 billion, which is 70% higher than it was previously estimated to be. And just a reminder to our audience, the federal government bought that pipeline in 2018. Despite the fact that it trampled over Indigenous lands and rights, despite the fact that there was huge pushback from environmentalists, and the project has basically just been riddled with delays and ballooning costs.
The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is of vital strategic interest to Canada. It will be built.
And I know that you're attending a rally this Saturday, Pam, against TMX Saturday. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you'll all be demanding?
Yeah, well, we're gathering specifically because over the time of the pandemic, we weren't able to gather as much as we wanted to. We weren't able to be in the streets safely as much as we wanted to. So we've got representatives from a whole bunch of different nations impacted by the pipeline. We also have First Nation advocates and human rights advocates and environmentalists all coming together to talk about what we need to do to stop Trans Mountain Pipeline. Not just Trans Mountain Pipeline, obviously Coastal Gas, LNG, and any of the other ones that are directly contributing to ongoing contamination and climate change, breaching Indigenous rights, but specifically Trans Mountain Pipeline, because there's simply no logical reason for going forward with it now.
Al, just as a final question to you, what do you think in your mind is an effective movement? What would an effective movement look like that can actually be a match for the Liberals' doublespeak and euphemisms and inaction, which has kind of been the theme for our whole conversation today? But yeah, specifically in relation to the climate crisis.
I mean, we have seen extremely effective young people's movements against the climate crisis for a long time. Obviously, Indigenous sovereignty is inherently tied up with climate justice, right? And there's no difference between that. But the problem, as with all movements, with the environmental movement, is there's always two streams, right? There's the radical movement that understands we have to end the status quo and that this is a problem rooted in capitalism and consumerism and corporatism, and we have to change those things. And then there's the green energy, just recycle, we can actually create different job stream. And that's always the danger. With any movement, that always happens. You have an extremely liberal movement that's kind of sold to people as environmentalism. So I think, it's not like we don't have a large environmental movement, but to continue it, we need to, I think, always be making the connection that the environment is at the root of a lot of injustices. You can't talk about prison justice without talking about the environment. Things like prisons are located in rural towns that have been stripped of their resource base, and then a prison comes in as an economic driver, and you talk about creating jobs, right? We can't talk about the military, right? Like, that's about environmental justice. Refugee and immigration and global migration is about climate justice. Work is inherently about those things. So all the movements that we have can be brought together. I think it's just really making those connections and expanding between movements and making sure that we're always building a solidarity, because we always have governments and corporations and military and media and, the academic institutions. They're all in solidarity. So our trick always has to be in the greatest amount of solidarity in our movements to counter that. And when we do that, we win.
And I think for a brief moment between 2019 and 2020, we had actually seen a radical framework go mainstream in the Green New Deal. This is a political framework that really marries dramatic action on climate change with bold, public-led, major government intervention in racial justice, in supporting Indigenous rights, in building out an epic program of, public transit and livable communities and renewable energy, and, all paid for by massive taxes on the wealthy and corporations. And, that, I think, is a winning electoral agenda, besides also, staving off climate catastrophe. And I remember, in 2019, 2020, there were liberals like Catherine McKenna who were kind of ostentatiously posting about on social media about how they had, were reading eco-socialist books like the one by Eric Holthouse. And I remember people like Gerald Butts, the former advisor to the Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, about, I saw him retweeting posts from the Sunrise Movement, which is the U.S. youth-led climate justice movement. And I remember chuckling, thinking, okay, clearly the liberals are anxious about the potential of the Green New Deal because they're really trying to posture and co-opt that energy. And it, to me, is a shame that the NDP's leadership has been, too out of touch to run aggressively with that political framework, because I think it can win.